From the St. Francis Yacht Club in San Francisco, this is the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, hosted by Ron Young.
Welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, live from the virtual grill room of the St. Francis Yacht Club. So those of us who grew up on the California West Coast remember as kids that there was a whole abalone industry. Buddies of mine, guys who were my dad's age and older kids when I was a teenager, they would go up on the North Coast and they'd dive for abalone. And it was a cool thing to be doing. I didn't do it myself, but I have lots of buddies who did. I always admired those guys. Japanese abalone fishermen first arrived in Monterey in the mid-1890s and quickly began to harvest what became a regional economic resource. Those first divers, called amas, dove into the cold waters of Monterey Bay in nothing but thin cotton outfits, which our speaker is going to show you in photographs in a little while. They also wore a pair of goggles, nothing like what you see in modern scuba diving. These guys were free divers of the first order. Within a year, they began to import helmet technology. And in 1908, a German restaurateur, Ernest Doelter, created the abalone steak in his Monterey restaurant. This transformed eating a rubber boot into an epicurean delight. By 1929, the California abalone industry was generating millions of dollars in revenue annually, 75% of which came from Monterey Bay, which by that time had become the abalone capital of the world. To tell us all about that, we have as our speaker today, historian emeritus of the Monterey Maritime Museum, Tim Thomas. Welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.
Thank you, Ron. It's my honor to be here today.
Great. Holy moly. So first of all, tell us where you are. What's this setting behind you right now?
So I'm actually in Monterey. I'm actually in the office of the Japanese American Citizens League Hall, which is downtown Monterey. The building was actually built in 1926 and has been in the hands of the Japanese since day one.
Wow. So now where were you born?
I was born in Carmel in 1954.
Carmel, California.
Correct.
Holy cazoli. When's the first time you heard the word abalone?
Wow, that's a good one. So I grew up around it. My father wasn't a diver. I didn't, but he was in the Highway Patrol, and one of his best friends, who also was a Highway Patrolman, was an abalone diver, and he used to have abalone barbecues in our backyard. When I was like 4 or 5, I can remember those.
Amazing. Yeah, and he was a free diver, any abalone diver.
He was probably wearing scuba gear in those days, but yeah.
Oh, he probably was wearing scuba gear?
Yeah.
Yeah. What did you do for a living? You don't start out becoming a historian. Where did you go to school? What was your
my journey here is a little complicated, but I grew up in Monterey. I'm actually a 4th generation native of the Monterey area. And when I grew up, they didn't teach us our local history, which is now mandatory in California schools, but it wasn't then. And I was always fascinated in the local history, in particular the fishing history. When I was a kid, Cannery Row, for example, was essentially abandoned. And we used to go down there and play in those old abandoned canneries. And I always wondered what they did in there, because they were just sort of they just closed them up one day, and there were still things in the lockers and that kind of thing. And of course, as I got older, I found out that my grandparents worked in those canneries. My grandmother was the secretary to the Cannery Workers Union at one time. And so these are things that always fascinated me. I went to work for the Monterey Bay Aquarium when they first opened the aquarium. And they actually got me involved in helping develop the first temporary exhibit they did called Whale Fest. And they brought me in to help write some living history pieces about whaling in Monterey Bay. And I wrote a couple of different pieces about modern whaler, early 20th century whaler and the 19th century whaler in Monterey Bay, and which eventually led me to the new Monterey Maritime Museum, which opened in 1992. And I was there for over 16 years.
So how many people worked in the canneries in those days?
Well, it depends. At the height of this cannery, there were 19 canneries in Monterey one time. There are 200 people working in each cannery, probably. So it was big business. They're catching an average of 235,000 tons of sardine in Monterey Bay every year between 1915 and 1950.
How much would a ton sell for?
It depends on the years. So when they were doing it, but fishermen were making, depending when they were catching them, up to $5 a ton and more. But it would fluctuate from year to year.
So $5 a ton, that's only $2 million on a $5 a ton basis. $2 million in the industry. And you're saying
you're talking about $19, $20, $19, $30.
Oh, yeah. So yeah, you're saying that it's a $50 million business, huh?
It was huge. Thank you. And first, let's get a little history about abalone. Abalone has been fished in Monterey, actually in California, for thousands of years. And Monterey actually was the sardine capital of the world. I mean, literally it was. And the first real abalone fishermen in Monterey in California were the native people. In Monterey, it was the Rumsen Ohlone people. And we can trace a native culture into the Monterey area about 10,000 years or so. I like to say they really were the first commercial fishermen in Monterey. And abalone plays a very, very important part of their life. I mean, they ate it. They used the shells to make tools like shovels and bowls and fish hooks. They used the shell to decorate baskets, to make jewelry, and they traded it to other California Indians for things they could not get here in Monterey, like obsidian, which is a volcanic rock, which they're using like arrow points and spear points. I'm sure many of you out there had seen one of the neatest part of the story is the word abalone, which is universal, used all over the world today, come from the Rumsian people. So here is a wonderful drawing of a Rumsian woman that was done by an unknown Spanish artist in the 1790s. And what I love about this drawing is it really does show you the connection to the bay here. So the inner skirt she's wearing is made out of tules. This outer skirt is deer hide. These black spots you see are actually the abalone pendants. The cape that she's wearing is probably sea otter pelt. And the necklace that she's wearing is little olivella shell, little sea snail. And the earpieces that she's wearing, this is what she's wearing in her ears, this piece right here. I took this photograph a few years ago at the British Museum in London. This piece was collected here in Monterey in the 1790s by a pretty well-known British explorer named George Vancouver. You can see it's partly woven like a basket. In fact, at one time, there are acorn woodpecker feathers in this weave. And then these white beads are large clamshell discs. The white beads are olivella shell beads, glass trade beads, abalone pendants, and then this long piece is bird bone. Bird bone is hollow, and they create this design that we today would call scrimshaw, and they'll use squidding to get that dark color. This is my good friend, Linda Yamane. Linda is world's leading scholar on Rumsen people. She is a Rumsen descendant that spent the last 35 years of her life researching this culture, bringing back language, songs, stories. Here she is in her abalone regalia. You see right here. Here's abalone fish hooks. Again, very, very important. You find these all over California. So there are times, particularly in the spring, when salmon are running in the bay, or chasing anchovies, they're just chasing literally onto the beaches along the Monterey shores.
So in other words, a salmon back in those days, chasing sardines, would chase them right up into the surf. So the salmon would be left on the beach flopping around until the next wave came in.
Literally waves that crash on these pouring fish onto the beach.
Wow. Okay. Holy cow.
Necklace that was made for a museum, Linda made for a museum in Japan. You notice the beautiful abalone pendants.
How many hours?
Olivella shell beads you see here.
How many hours of work would that shell necklace take?
Oh, a few days anyway, for sure. This is a basket that Linda made. Linda is the first Ohlone basket weaver in 150 years. These are olivella shell beads. Of course, there's the abalone pendants you see here. Then the red feathers historically would have been acorn woodpecker feathers. But because you can't get acorn woodpecker feathers like this, I mean, it would have taken literally hundreds of acorn woodpecker to give up their lives to get these feathers. And she had to use chicken feathers that she cut and had to get the right dyes to get the right color. It took her a long time to experimenting with dyes to get those colors. So let's go to the Japanese story. So Japanese fishermen arriving in Monterey, and so Japanese fishermen arriving in Monterey in the mid 1890s. This gentleman here is named Otto Sabaru Noda, and he is really responsible for all the Japanese coming to Monterey. So Noda got a job working for the then land arm of the Southern Pacific Railroad, Pacific Improvement Company, about 1895, 1896. He was sort of a labor contractor. At that time, the Southern Pacific, or the Pacific Improvement Company, owned about 8,000 acres of the Monterey Peninsula, because they had this quirky idea they could turn Monterey into a tourist paradise. Who thinks such a thing? So he was hired to bring in other workers, and also he was sort of a gatherer of wood for these work and labor camps. And he was up on a tree one day near the Monterey Wharf and looked down into the harbor and just saw this huge amount of abalone. Like so much abalone, he literally described it in a letter as being a carpet of abalone, and nobody doing anything with it. And the reason nobody was doing anything with it, because nobody knew, well, what the heck he's supposed to do with it. Like preparing abalone properly is kind of like eating a rubber boot. The Japanese were dealing with abalone for centuries, knew exactly what to do with it. Notice-on writes a letter back from government of Japan, said, hey, all this abalone here, nobody wants it. The government of Japan sends this guy right here named Jinosuke Kodani, who was in the abalone business in the Chiba prefecture of Japan. He comes over and goes, oh, this is great. He sends back to Japan for abalone divers known as ama, or free divers. There's a close-up of Onoda, who was so important here. That's Mr. Kodani, you see right there. Handsome gentleman that he is. He sends back to Japan for ama divers or free divers. And we know who these two guys were. I have seen their passports, actually. They came over and were picked up at the train station here in Monterey about 1897. At that point, Noda had gone down to what's now Cannery Road and leased a small piece of property down there and sent back to Japan for other fishermen, and created sort of a Japanese fishing colony on that site there. These ama came down, were taken down to Noda's fishing colony, dressed that first day in the traditional ama gear, which you can see consists of a little white cotton outfit here with the abalone basket, abalone pry, pair of goggles, which actually would have pig's bladders on the end. They would squeeze to help release the pressure.
So that all the companies doing this were Japanese companies who knew how to do it in Japan and imported the talent, skilled labor.
Kodani brought these divers from Japan, from the area where he lived, and they began to dive. But as you can see, though, I come out that anybody's been to Monterey or even in San Francisco, you know, that water is not known for its warmth. Well, Monterey Bay average is about 55 degrees. Japan, it's about 65 degrees or 70 degrees even in some places. So it's much warmer. So this, by the way, is the site on Cannery Road that Noda had his work camp, his fishing camp. This is where those ama divers first went. This is the beach they went off of and dove in Monterey Bay right here. So they very quickly, when it started to bring in helmet divers, this was new technology in Japan at that time, and they began to bring in helmet gear. I love this particular photograph. This is taken out at Point Lobos. So Kodani wandered around the Monterey Peninsula, walked into Point Lobos. Anybody, I'm sure many of your members have been out to Point Lobos. My friend Sandy Lyden, who's an historian of Santa Cruz, like to say that Point Lobos is the center of the universe. I love this photo. Here's Kodani here. I can tell in the photograph that the gear is new because there's no dents in the helmet. And so these divers all learned to be knitters. Initially, they would take wool sweaters and tear them apart, and they would knit wool underwear. Put on a pair of that, sometimes two pairs of that, put on their clothes, put on a big heavy canvas suit. They would attach about 65 pounds of the lead weights on the front and back, tie lead to their shoes, bolt on the helmet, which of course has a hose attached to it. They go down into the Monterey Bay. In the early days, they would hand pump the air down to the diver. And he's going down 15, 20, 30 feet into the Monterey Bay. The deeper he went, the harder it was to pump. This is another photograph taken at Point Lobos. You can see the two dive boats here. And what they did was, these are actually two old Monterey whaling boats, which they converted to the dive boats. Again, you can see the divers. Again, you can see the gear is new. So this can date this picture just by the gear they're wearing. So at the turn of the 20th century. And everybody on the boat, with two exceptions, are all Japanese guys on the boat here, with two exceptions are this guy right here. This is actually an old Portuguese whaler.
When these abalone divers are harvesting the abalone now, are they originally sending them to Japan, or are they eating them here in Monterey?
There's no local market for abalone. They were drying it, and shipping it back to Japan. They were shipping it to China. They were shipping it to Hawaii, where there was a large Chinese market there that would buy it.
Wait a second. Those are empty shells right there?
Those are empty shells. These are all red abalone. Yeah.
Now, when the abalone is face down on the rock, the top of the shell is also reflective and shiny?
No.
Well,
That's
so,
the
but that
inside of the
original guy who looked down there and saw the abalone, he knew what he was looking at, even though he didn't see the reflective surface of the inside of the shell.
These guys knew what they're looking for sure. And the Japanese been diving abalone for centuries before they came here. The Japanese had the first abalone farm before the turn of the 20th century. So abalone, big deal in Japan. So this is A.M. Allen. A.M. Allen was Kodani's partner. A.M. Allen was a mining engineer. He was also a racetrack designer. He designed, I believe, Tanforan Park up there in San Francisco. He came to Monterey, came to Point Lobos because he was a partner in a coal mine that was at Point Lobos at that time. Coal that was coming out of that mine was really a low-grade coal. It wasn't doing very well. They weren't selling it. So the company decided to sell the property. So Allen thought, well, maybe I could do something with it. So he bought the property from his partners, went around and bought the few lots that had been sold. And it was really Allen that preserved Point Lobos. He actually leased the property initially to Kodani, watched him operate for about a year, became Kodani's partner in the abalone business out there. So here is the Point Lobos Canning Company. And again, if you know Point Lobos, so here's the cannery from Point Lobos right here, and where they were canning abalone and that kind of thing. This little wharf, actually, there was a whale fishery here in the 19th century. This was left over from the whale fishery that was out there. So this is one of those divers that came to Monterey. This is a guy named Watanabe. I've been to they all come from the little area in Japan. Anybody's been to Japan, you know that Japan is broken up in what they call prefects, kind of like states. These guys all come from the Chiba prefecture. If you've ever gone to Japan, you fly into Narita Airport, which is in the Chiba prefecture. These guys come from an area known as the Boso, a big, beautiful peninsula. Really what Boso means is peninsula, which is a lot like Monterey, and it's a fishing community. And I've been there many times, a little town called Shirahama, where many of these divers came from. And you visit a lot of little houses where these divers lived. You'll see these photographs, and you'll see the diver all dressed in Western garb. And down below it says F.L. Swain Portraits, Monterey, California. So here's another one of those guys, named Kawagami, another one of those divers. Again, same. So they all got dressed one day, I guess, and went down and got their picture taken. These pictures are about 1908 or so. And Kawagami also was a maker. He would take the abalone shells and producing abalone jewelry and things he's selling to the tourists. We're on the 17-mile drive. If you look closely, you'll see this, what we call the watch fob. It's heart-shaped. That's made out of Monterey red abalone. And the family actually still has that watch fob right there. So here is a photograph I found fairly recently, and there's Kawagami and Mr. Watanabe right there, the same two guys. And then there is Kodani on the boat, and there you can see the hand pump right there.
So that hand pump would pump water down,
pump air down to the diver.
And when the divers came up, did they have to? You mentioned earlier they came up slowly because they didn't have the theory of bends. But from practical knowledge, they knew you couldn't come up quickly.
They did know that. And they also, at a 30-foot level, bends weren't really an issue. But bends is something they would get from time to time. So it was something, and they learned how to deal with it. But yeah.
What was the fatality rate among divers?
As far as diving, none, 0 in Monterey.
They didn't die because
they were very safety conscious. There was some divers that died, not in Monterey, but because of storms and that kind of thing. But as far as they were very safety conscious as to their diving.
How were storms a danger?
So the diver in particular, the one I'm thinking of, this is a diver in the water, the storm capsizing the boat, tearing the hose out from the diver, and he drowned.
Wow, so he was underwater, also water. He couldn't come up fast enough and he died.
Right. Exactly. So this is a beautiful drawing done by a guy named Ray Troll. Today, Ray Troll lives in Alaska, and in the marine science world, Ray Troll was considered to be like Picasso. And this is from a mural he did here in Pacific Grove for NOAA, actually. And this is from some exhibits I had at the Maritime Museum. This is, of course, AMA divers underwater. This is a woman AMA diver. We don't know if there are women divers in Monterey. They're mostly men. There are no photographs of women divers in Monterey at that time. I have one report that I saw that came from the Japanese government. From time to time would send an emissary from Japan to come to California, to come to Monterey to check on their people, to see how they're being treated. And in 1902, a guy wrote a report saying that there was a company in Monterey that employed Japanese diving women. But if they did, it was only for one season. And so we don't know if they did or they didn't yet. But
that mask looks like a modern mask. It doesn't look like goggles. Is that accurate or not?
This is an early mask, actually. This mask probably from the teens. One I collected from Japan, actually, that he used. It was from an exhibit I had at the museum.
Okay, so this guy's diving. I see like 5 abalone shells there. What are the other items down there? Did they harvest anything beside abalone?
No, they're just after the abalone. Yeah, sometimes they would take sea urchins and things, but really they were after abalone.
Okay.
And actually, AMA, these guys would work in pairs normally, because they actually AMA dived in Monterey into the 1920s, right? And so they would work in pairs, and there would be on a boat. In the middle of the boat, there was a barrel with a fire going constantly. And the AMA diver would go into the water. He'd tie a rope around his waist that ran through a pulley system. They'd follow the anchor line down maybe 30, 40 feet. And then, as I mentioned earlier, he could hold his breath, and these guys up to 3 minutes. When it was ready for him to come up to the surface, his partner on the boat would take the other end of that rope. There'd be a weight tied around it, usually just a big rock, and he'd toss it over the side of the boat that would just yank that diver up to the surface. And then he would warm himself up on the fire while his partner goes down under the water to collect abalone. So as I'm sure you all know, there was a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment in this country at that time, coming primarily from white workers who were convinced the Japanese are coming to take their job, which really wasn't the case. But they were also very, very suspicious about what they were doing. They didn't believe they were actually collecting abalone. This is a newspaper story that I actually found from a newspaper that appeared in Birmingham, Alabama. So this is a story that went all across the United States. It says yellow spies work Frisco. About 1907. This is actually right after the Japanese had completed that war with Russia. They had beat Russia. This article appeared. If you read what the article goes on to say, is they did not believe the Japanese were collecting abalone, but what they were actually doing was they were mapping the Monterey Bay, prepared for the Japanese army to land at Santa Cruz, then march over the hills and take the city of San Francisco.
Pardon me.
So here is a label. Again, as I mentioned, they began to produce and try to market us to the Western audiences. It was still a tough sell, abalone, in the canned abalone. They were also selling it to the Japanese market. Canned abalone in Japan was not a popular thing. They didn't like the canned abalone until this guy appeared. This is a German restaurateur named Ernest Doelter. Doelter, when he was a young man, he was about 18 when he came to the United States with his sister. And he was in New York initially and got jobs working in restaurants in New York City. Then when he received his naturalization papers, he moved west. And he got a job in San Francisco, initially at the Cliff House, actually. And he also worked as a private chef in San Francisco. And one of those families he worked for actually spent time in Monterey at the Hotel Del Monte, which is a very famous and fancy hotel. And they used to bring, when the rich people would come, all their maids and chefs and everyone would all go with them to stay at the hotel. But he came to Monterey eventually in 1907 and opened a small restaurant on Alvarado Street called the Cafe Ernest.
Okay.
So Pop did, one of our jobs he was the chief steward at the San Francisco Yacht Club, which was then located in Sausalito. In those days, oysters was a very popular thing. People ate a lot of oysters in the United States, and you don't get a lot of oysters in Monterey Bay, so he would get his oysters from San Francisco. They were actually raising oysters and oyster beds and like oyster farms in San Francisco Bay at that time. Those things would come by train. And when you're saying about trains have a tendency to break down, or there'll be a cow on the track, and the shellfish don't tend to stay fresh very long. So oftentimes his order of oysters would arrive in Monterey at the train station, they'd be spoiled. So he was always looking for something new. And he was fascinated with the abalone thing. He was watching all this dried abalone leaving Monterey. He figured maybe I could do something with that. So he brought this abalone into his restaurant. This is Pop's restaurant on Alvarado Street. Here he is right here. And then these are his kids. That's his daughter, and this is his two sons right here. He brought it into his restaurant and he experimented with it. And he finally came up with this famous recipe where you slice the foot, because that's the eating abalone is the foot. And you pound it to make it nice and soft. And you don't just pound it. There's a certain technique to doing that. Then you run it through egg wash, cracker crumbs, and cook it up quickly in olive oil. And soon people came from all over to eat fresh abalone steaks in Pop's restaurant. And they would sing songs and write poetry. Like some folks boast the quail on toast because they think it's Tony, but I'm content to owe my rent and live on abalone. And here's a page from his guest books with that poem, which is now called the Abalone Song, actually, in his guest book. So the family, the Doelter family, still has these guest books. There are literally hundreds of these written in there. So in 1913, a couple of things happened. One of them was that the state of California made it illegal for the Japanese to export dried abalone out of the state. They could ship this canned product, they couldn't ship the dried product. But the Japanese did not want the canned product. They didn't like it. They wanted the dried product. Also, Pop was offered a job to bring his abalone recipes to a restaurant in San Francisco called the Hofbrau, which is on the corner of Market and 4th Street. Today, there's a building called the Pacific Building, which is still there today. They've been in the Pacific Building today, I believe. I've been in a long time, but there was a big Nordstrom's in there and a number of other things. But down below in the basement, there's a big food court. And that's exactly where the Hofbrau restaurant was, where Pop introduced abalone steaks to the world at this restaurant. Here is a menu from the Hofbrau restaurant from about 1914. And you can see here down below, you can see glued on the bottom, abalone specials, abalone cocktail, 25 cents, abalone salad, soups, abalone nectar, that's just the juice that came out of the shell. You can get that hot or cold. This is the first time ever the abalone appeared on a menu.
The abalone gets pried off of the rock under the ocean.
Correct.
It's brought up to the surface.
Right.
How do you get abalone juice? How come the juice didn't?
It's the juice that comes out of the meat of the abalone. That's it.
Okay, so when you cook the abalone,
No, even before it's cooked, you pry it out. There's going to be juice from the abalone. It's going to.
so they bring up the shell, and when they pull the shell off of the abalone meat, the
Right.
juice
You
that comes
pull the
off.
actual animal out of the shell.
I get it. Then they keep the quote juice, which is basically ripped up fluid from the flesh being ripped off of the shell. I get it. And the abalone grows on the inside. It grows this shell. The fish itself grows the shell, just like every other kind of shell. How old are abalone when they're harvested?
Depends. So abalone grows very slow in the wild. They'll grow in the farm situation today. Abalone grows about an inch a year. In the wild, it's much slower.
So one that's 8 inches across is 8 years old?
From the farm situation, yeah. From the wild, it could be 10 years old. So abalone will live 40 years or so or more. I've seen abalone shells that were taken out of Monterey Bay that were huge. It means abalone had to be over 100 years old.
How big is the biggest one you've ever seen?
The biggest one ever collected, they say, is about 14 inches. I've seen them 12 inches. Yeah.
Wow.
Those are old abalone, yeah.
And what's the difference in the flavor of a 10-year-old abalone and a 100-year-old abalone?
I don't know what the different flavor is. I would guess that the old abalones would be tougher, but I think the flavor is probably the same.
And how does the abalone feed itself face down with the shell on top?
Abalone is a large marine snail, and it eats kelp.
So it gradually just moves across the rock?
Yeah, they move. They're fast, actually.
How-
And we've had abalone races actually here in Monterey.
What?
And By the way, red abalone is called red abalone because it eats mostly red kelp, and so it takes on that color on the shell.
Okay, so we've seen a snail, how slow a snail is. They're pretty slow. How fast is an abalone? Slower than a snail?
No, I can't say how fast a garden snail can go, but I've seen abalone. They can move pretty quickly.
Show me with your hand. Like this?
Yeah, that seems about right. We move even faster than that. We've done these races where we put them in a baby pool, and then we cover them up. Then we lift up the cover, and they'll take off for the shade. We'll put an umbrella in the middle of that pool, and they'll go pretty quick.
How an inch a minute?
I couldn't tell you that. I don't know. So this is an ad that appears in the Central Chronicle every week because they used to get the abalone from Point Lobos. The wholesomest shellfish is the abalone, clings to the rocks and feeds on seaweed and mosses. We get them daily by express, direct from Point Lobos, Carmel Bay. Packed in seaweed, they arrive here not only fresh, but alive and kicking. If you want a new gastronomic sensation, visit the Hofbrau. This Hofbrau, this would be about 1914 or so.
1913. And how long did it operate, that particular Hofbrau?
They actually operated, they changed their name to the States Restaurant when, because there was a lot of anti-German sentiment in the United States at the beginning of World War I. And so they operated, I believe, into the 30s. And then there was a Hofbrau restaurant, and maybe connected to them that continued for a long time. And that throughout the Central Bay area, actually. So what happens? Of course, the worlds come to San Francisco. The Panama Pacific International Exposition, which was the World's Fair, 1915, and they built the Palace of Fine Arts was built for that World's Fair. That was all big. That was all big mud flat. It was all filled in for this World's Fair, about 600 acres, and every state was represented. All kinds of new products introduced at this World's Fair. It was a really big deal. And California had the largest of the state buildings. It was 5 acres in size. Every county was represented in the California State Building. So let's go visit Monterey County. Here's our ticket to the World's Fair right there. And then here we are, Monterey County exhibit called the Mission County. But what do you see right here is the abalone diver in the big case right here. And the abalone right here. Look at all the abalone shells you see right here. More abalone shells right here. They're really promoting abalone. Now, there are different kinds of abalone you see here. So there are 8 varieties of abalone in California. The red abalone is what these guys are really after. But in California, at this time, there were 7 or so different abalone. They're getting pink abalone, green abalone, black abalone. The white abalone, which wasn't discovered until 1939, which by a Monterey abalone diver, I might add, named Roy Hattori. The abalone was very, very important. And then, so here is our abalone diver. Take a look at the face of the diver, and there he is right there. That's the same. So that's my old friend, Roy Hattori. And then here he is right here when he is 90. He was 18 in this picture. He was 90 in this picture.
What year was he born?
He was born in 1920. And what's important about Roy, he's important for a lot of reasons, but Roy is the only Japanese diver that was born here. He was Nisei. All the other divers came from Japan, with just a couple of exceptions returned to Japan. Roy was born here, just a couple of blocks from the Monterey Bay Aquarium is today. So I asked him how he learned how to do this. He told me when he was a young man, that was during the Depression. His father had a lot of debts to pay. Roy had just graduated from Monterey High School. His father wanted to get into the abalone business. He thought this would be a good way to make some money, but he had no experience in this business whatsoever. But he bought a boat and converted to dive abalone. He borrowed some equipment, took Roy in the little boat in the middle of Monterey Harbor, dressed him up in this wool underwear you see right here. In fact, Roy told me that his mother needed this underwear. And then they put it up put on his clothes, put on the heavy canvas suit, attached to 65 pounds of lead weights to his front and back, tied lead to his shoes, bolted on the helmet. They just tossed him off the side of the boat. Said, "You start running down there." That's how he learned to be an abalone diver. Luckily, the older divers took him under their wing, kind of showed him what to do out there. I also might add, the wool underwear. There was a dive company in Tokyo that produced this dive underwear strictly for the divers in Monterey.
Would that get wet because it was not a watertight suit, or would it stay?
Yeah, sure would. But the wool keeps them warm.
Okay. When I was a young sailor, we didn't have foul weather gear. Gore-Tex wasn't invented yet. And so we basically wore wool sweaters and even wool pants. But you wear wool sweaters underneath something called a teddy bear, quasi brown denim-y jacket. But the wool was the warm thing you wore underneath against your skin. Yeah.
This is Roy here getting his dress on. You can see here, this is his brother here and his cousin. See right there. And then here's all the different kind of gear they were using. You can see, again, all this gear came from Japan. They didn't like the American gear. They wanted the Japanese gear. So the suit, the dress, the lead weights, the helmet, the collar they'd wear, the hooks on where the weights would dive onto it, and that you screwed the helmet onto here, 2 abalone baskets that you see right here, and then the lifeline that we hold right here. Also, they use it to tug, and I'll talk about the net here. So here's Roy getting ready to go into the water. And you can now take a look at his helmet. Note the dents on the helmet that you see right there. And they get ready to screw that helmet on.
And they screwed on like screwed on with
screwed on. Exactly.
But I'm sure they leaked a little bit. Who knows, right? Yeah.
Well, they were pretty airtight when they put them on there right there.
Okay.
So here he is getting ready to go in the water down the ladder you see right here. So I asked Roy about diving, and I asked him if you ever had any trouble down there, any problems down there. And he said, yeah, sometimes the currents will be really strong and kick up rocks. One time a rock kicked up, hit in a helmet, cracked the glass on his helmet. So you're 30 feet below the Monterey Bay, you just cracked the glass on your helmet. What are you going to do? You want to get to the surface, right? It take a long time. They can't just pull him back up. What he has to do, he has to release a valve on the side of the helmet that will fill up the suit with air that will eventually float him back up. But that's just going to take way too long. So what he did, and I think this is the most remarkable thing, he just reached into his abalone basket, pulls out the abalone, which is just a big marine snail, takes the abalone and sticks it on the glass. And the abalone seals up the crack and stops the water from coming in. He then goes back to the surface, changes the glass, starts all over again.
Wow.
He told me that
the
was
abalone
smart.
is the patch.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, on the front of the glass, if it's big enough. Okay.
So here he is, you can see underwater. And so they're holding on to the line here. Here's the hose here. And then he would use that line. So the diver going to the water at 9 o'clock in the morning, collecting abalone, he'd go back up about 12 for lunch, then go back down about 1, stay down until about 4, then go back up for the evening. When he filled the basket up, he would pull on the line a certain signal, and then the guy knew to pull up the basket and send another one down to fill it up. Now, I love this. This is the dive boat. They go out for 3 days at a time. There was a mother boat, and I'll show you a picture of that a little bit here. This is the dive boat. And so this had a motor on it. This is the cover for the motor. You'll note there's a tea kettle here that kept the water warm. And then there was a pair of shoes there. And I asked Roy, why are these shoes up there? Because it kept so when I got out of the water, I could put my shoes on and kept my feet warm all the time. Then you see the guy in the back on the stern here with the skull. So this is technology that came from Japan. And so they would use the sculling oar, so you didn't have to use the motor. And they could follow the diver under the water by tracking his buttons. That's how they follow him, by using the skull. So oftentimes in Southern California, where there's another large abalone fishery, but it was mostly white workers, white divers, they used their motor. And it wasn't uncommon for those motors to run over that hose. And so here they used the skull, didn't have that problem.
What happened with the motor? The motor would melt the hose?
So the motor, oftentimes on the boat here in Southern California, when they're using the motor, they would not uncommon for them to run over the diver's hose and cut it. And so they didn't do that. They used that skull, didn't have that issue to do that. So this is a very rare photograph. This is the only known photograph of a Monterey Abalone dive crew operating. The ones I've been showing you earlier are actually taken by a local photographer as a possible magazine article for Life magazine. But this is taken at Point Sur light station, off Point Sur light station. You can see the dive boat here and the hose here. And then you can see the bubble of the diver right here. And then the guy on the skull right here. And there are 3 guys on the boat right here.
How far out would they usually go to fish?
Well, you can see how close they are right here.
Right.
They would travel, though, fairly long distances. So they would go from Monterey all the way down to Santa Barbara and that area down there, all past Santa Cruz and further north. And they could go further out, but they stayed fairly close to shore. But they could go up pretty good distances out
Are
there.
there just as many abalone in the deep as there is in the shoreline?
Yes, the farther deeper out they went, the better they were getting abalone, for sure. No, I had this photograph for years. This was taken by a fish and game biologist named J.D. Phillips. I always often wondered where he was to take this picture. It says on the back of the image was at Point Sur. Now I'm a docent at Point Sur Light Station. Anybody who's ever taken that tour, you have to go up the road to the lighthouse. And I've done that now that I give that tour. I'm doing it for a couple of years. I finally was able to figure out exactly where he was when he took this picture. I was very excited about that.
So since abalone are shellfish that moves along rocks, what if there's no rocky bottom, there's no abalone?
Right.
If it's just marsh or if it's just mud, no abalone.
Right. So they went where the abalone were, right? And Roy told me, and every diver had their own certain technique to get them. So we said one guy used to sort of crouch and jump around like a frog. So there's another diver get on his belly like a snake and move around. And Roy said you could just sneak up on him and pick him up. But abalone do stick, and they have the abalone pry that they use to pull them off that rock and whatnot.
So that's their defensive device. When they're in danger, they flat as they could get against the rock to get hard for an animal to pry them up. So what is the normal, other than human beings, what are the normal predators for abalone?
Sea stars eat them. Sea otters love to eat abalone. I did an oral history with a gentleman who lived at Point Sur in the 1920s. His father was a lighthouse keeper there, and he was a young man at the time. And he loved to watch the divers. But the divers' issue were sea otters. The sea otters are going after their abalone when they're trying to pull them back up. But they're a nuisance to them. And Harry, the guy's name was Harry Miller, told me that these divers were hunting these sea otters at night because they were such a nuisance to them. So the folks at the light station told the California Department of Fish and Game, hey, these guys are hunting sea otters. California Department of Fish and Game said, well, that's impossible because the sea otter is extinct. But no, they were not. They were down at Point Sur.
So how would the sea otter pry the abalone off the bottom? By their hand?
They'd go after it. Well, they could do it because they had strong claws and whatnot on their arm, but they could do it. But they were going after when they're pulling the basket back up, they'd go after that basket and pull out of it.
Wow.
And the divers used to call those guys sea cats. They look like cats with their little. So here is pulling up the basket full of abalone here. Onto the boat right there. And you can see the hose right there. So they mentioned all these photographs were taken for a guy named Ray Ruppel, who was actually, Roy and Ray were really close friends at the time. And Ray was a local photographer. And he did a whole series of these images. And these were taken in 1938. And the idea was he was going to sell them to Life magazine. They had agreed that, yeah, you can send them to us. And so he took the photographs, sent them to Life magazine. And they held on to them for a few years, and then World War II broke out, and they never used them. So these photographs were rarely ever seen till about 10 years ago.
What's the history of sharks in abalone divers?
Well, there's certainly sharks there, but they never were a problem. I asked Roy about that. He said, "Yeah, we see them, but they never bothered us." Pretty much how he said it.
The sharks were not interested in the abalone divers.
And they didn't seem to be interested in the divers either. So there's the mother boat. They bring all the abalone back in after about 3 days. I should point out by 1920, there were 9 different companies operating off the Monterey Wharf. Each company had all their own boats and divers. So they would dive the abalone during the day, keep the abalone fresh. They kept them in these boxes called live boxes. Again, this is technology that came from Japan. They'd pile the abalone on top of each other inside these boxes, which were made locally out of redwood. And they keep the boxes in the water, because that kept them fresh. And then they bring them into Monterey. This is Monterey Wharf. And then they begin to unload them into the. So I should point out that prior to World War II, the majority of the business on the Monterey Wharf were Japanese-owned businesses. Abalone processors, fish markets, big business there. So here is a boat. I mentioned there were 9 different companies, each boat coming in with about 200 dozen large red abalone. This is full of red abalone you see right here. And they're unloading it. It goes directly from the boat right up into the cannery right there. And then here into the cannery, these are all Japanese workers inside the cannery.
Did you say 200 dozen abalone?
200 dozen, yeah.
So that's like 2,500, that's 2,400 abalone is what you're saying.
Yeah, each boat had that much, at least that much. So these workers, all Japanese workers, these ladies are pulling abalone out of the shell. That's what they're doing right there. And then they are.
What were they doing with these shells in these big factories? What was
they just dumping them?
Really?
So it was against the California passed the law in 1913, actually making it illegal to export the shell out of the state of California. And so they were just dumping them over the side of the wharf, or they were trucking them out to Seaside, which is a little town here in the Monterey Peninsula, or out to Marina, where they just dumped them in the big sand dunes out there. But whole industry developed around all that abalone shell, which they can't really get into today. Will never get done here. But here they are pulling them out of the shell right there in the cannery on the wharf. And then she is cutting it, trimming it. That's what she's doing right there.
Was it when you ordered an abalone dinner? Would it be
Yes,
just
one abalone steak? Papa Ernest had big steak. So Hattori's mother had her own cannery, and she had a contract with Papa Ernest's restaurant, and she would prepare these big steaks just for his restaurant. And he had moved his restaurant by 1919. He moved his restaurant he'd come back to Monterey from San Francisco in 1917. And then in 1919, he opened a restaurant on the wharf, the very first restaurant on the wharf, and became known as the Abalone King. There's the full abalone here, and then she's trimming it. That's what she's doing right here. But all this was used. And so all this stuff they trimmed off of here, because they just want the foot part, but all this would be used. They used to sell it like hamburger, almost like a hamburger kind of thing was being sold. So here they are slicing it to make the abalone steaks. That's what they're doing right there.
The workers are also Japanese, because these are Japanese.
All Japanese workers, yeah. And then pounding the abalone here.
Wow.
Technique that Papa Ernest developed.
This is tenderizing the abalone.
Correct.
The mallet.
With the wooden mallet. Work with the Monterey Japanese American Citizens League in Monterey. I'm on their board of directors and the curator of the Japanese American Citizens League Heritage Center. We have a beautiful little museum here that has all this whole story there. We have a number of artifacts connected to this history in our museum. You're all welcome to come down and see it anytime.
What are those white pedestals made of that they're pounding?
They're just wooden. In fact, sometimes I just took tree trunks and turned them into a little. I have one of these pounding tables in my museum. So here's Pop at his restaurant on the wharf.
What year?
1925. He was famous for his abalone stew that he would serve in the shell. That's what these ladies are eating right here. And filled the whole of the shell with lead. He actually died in 1934, but his 2 sons continued to run the restaurant until 1952. And then they sold it. Some of you may remember there was a restaurant called Cerritos on Monterey Wharf, and the Cerrito family took over Pop's restaurant. It was right at the foot of the Monterey Wharf. That's where it was. And it burned down in 1970. He was the very first guy in the United States to try to develop an abalone farm. He bought property down in the Big Sur area in 1925. The same year this picture was taken, to develop an abalone farm. He got permission from the federal government to do it. But he wasn't able to get them to reproduce. So it was a failure, but others tried. It wasn't really until the 1960s when they finally were able to get them to reproduce in the United States anyway, and the farm situation. Today, there are abalone farms. We have a big abalone farm here in Monterey, and there are, I think, 5 abalone farms in all of California. So there is no commercial abalone fishery in California today. There's no sport fishery for abalone today. So the only abalone you're going to get if you go to a restaurant is either farm raised or it's coming from Mexico. or you can buy canned abalone that's coming from Asia.
How do you seed an abalone farm?
So you get there's actually buy little, or you grow little abalone, but they actually call them seedlings. And they're little baby little abalones, and they grow them in Monterey. There's a big farm on wharf number 2. They're raised in big baskets underneath the wharf, and they start them out in little seedlings, and then they grow. They sell them at about 4 or 5 inches, I think, when they start to sell them to restaurants and things.
What size are the seedlings?
Oh, they're like an inch or smaller, even some cases, little teeny things.
Okay, and people go play the people who harvest them go down and lay them on the rock and then see them grow, etc.
Yeah, no, they actually create the seedlings in the farming, all that. It's all done. Yeah, it's the whole thing is. So he was a master of marketing his restaurant. You might notice the red fez. Oh, the fez you see right here, he always wore this fez. Nobody knows why, not even his family, right? I believe it's something he got at that World's Fair. This is a very, very famous menu, the giveaway. And this was done by 2 very famous Monterey artists. They did it for free abalone dinners. The middle section here was done by a guy named Joe Mora, who's a very famous Western artist in the Monterey, actually all over the world today. And then the outer section was done by a guy named Armin Hansen. And if you haven't heard of those guys, go home and Google those guys. A lot of stuff will come up about them, particularly Armin Hansen. Armin Hansen is an internationally known artist today. Crocker Museum in Sacramento was working with a museum in Southern California that did a big traveling exhibit of Armin Hansen's work. And they contacted me because Armin Hansen did a lot of fishing stuff, and they wanted some history. And they did not know this existed. So I sent them this, and this became part of their catalog as well, this wonderful menu you see right here.
Where does he get the name Pop, the nickname Pop?
His kids used to refer to him as Pop. That was part of where he got that nickname. But also, just as they were celebrity chefs, today there were celebrity chefs in the early part of the 20th century in San Francisco, when he was working in San Francisco at the turn of the 20th century. And later there were 2 chefs there that were very well known who also went by that nickname of Pop. So I actually believe he picked up that name because he thought it was a good way to market himself, because they connect him with the other Pops and became Pop. This is a beautiful leather postcard from the turn of the 20th century, very popular. Of course, there's our abalone you see right there. And I think I bored you guys enough, so thank you.
So Tim, you wrote a book.
I did, called The Abalone King of Monterey.
And it's about
Pop Ernest, but really it's about the Japanese abalone fishery here and how important it was, not just to Monterey, but to California. So in my view, the abalone fishery in Monterey is the most important fishery, at least historically, maybe not economically, but it is historically and culturally in all of California.
When did you start the book? When did you finish?
I started the book in 2011. It was published in 2013.
2 years.
Yeah.
How many pages?
About 200.
How many illustrations?
It's about 20, I think, maybe a little more than that.
Wonderful. Historian emeritus of the Monterey Maritime Museum. What a great, fun talk. All about how when abalone ruled the world. So the Japanese discovered abalone in Monterey, began to harvest and exploit the business. Pop Warner comes to town, helps market the product in the Monterey area, and then up in San Francisco, then back in Monterey.
Right.
What a great story. Thank you so much. Now, if people want to see more about abalone history in Monterey Bay, where would they go?
Yes, we have a website. The Monterey Japanese American Citizens League has a website. Just Google Monterey JCL. That will link you to our Heritage Center.
And if they want to reach you, what email address should I give them for you?
timsardine@yahoo.com.
So Tim Thomas, the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon is very pleased to have this opportunity to interview you and speak with you all about the abalone history in Monterey Bay. Thank you very much for being our guest on a Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.
Thank you. It was my honor.
This has been a presentation of the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.